good news about rigging quadrupeds is you actually have most of the skills you need already if you know how to rig a biped in order to rig a quadruped. And this first simple rig we're going to look at really has very little that you haven't already done. We'll just kind of walk through and see how it's applied in this slightly different situation with the anatomy of a quadruped. So let's start by looking at the legs here. Now again, this is a simplified rig, so we're actually going to be kind of simplifying the anatomy and skipping some of the moving parts that we would want to have in a more realistic rig. So on the front legs here, these are set up very much like a human arm with a shoulder, elbow, wrist, and then the toes or fingers. But on quadrupeds, we also sometimes want to include the scapula, which on a real animal would actually be attached up here somewhere, and the shoulder would be right about here. The anatomy in this illustration isn't exactly realistic, so the scapula is sort of suggested down here somewhere. But it's essentially like a shoulder blade that will rotate off of the top of the rib cage, and then the shoulder attaches to that, giving the whole front arm a kind of Z-shaped bend from the wrist up to the elbow to the shoulder, and then up the scapula to where it attaches at the top of the rib cage. But including the scapula isn't really necessary for a simple quadruped rig, and in that case, when you don't need the Z bend, you can just simply rig the front arm as an arm. Shoulder, elbow, the wrist, and then the hand / foot / paw. Now truthfully, there's another joint in here, just like there would be between the palm and the fingers on a human hand. On quadrupeds, that palm is called the pastern, and in both humans and animals is made up of the carpus and the metacarpus bones. The finger or toe bones, called phalanges, attach to those metacarpals. So for a more realistic rig, we'd want that pastern attaching at the wrist, and then the toes, either separately or as a group, attaching to the pastern, the way we have our foot here. But for this very simple rig, we're skipping that extra joint. We're just treating the toes as the foot or goal in a two-layer IK with goal. And this works just fine to create a decently realistic movement on those front legs. Now on the back legs, the anatomy is also a little bit different than what we would have on a human anatomy, and again we're going to be simplifying for the sake of this rig. Now on the back legs here, we do have the heel and toe separated. In human terms, this is the toe here, and this is the heel. Now I'm using the terms heel and toe, the human terms, to help you see the comparative anatomy and therefore the comparative rigging strategies between the bipeds and the quadrupeds. These two parts on a quadruped would normally be called the rear pastern and the toes, or the tarsus, metatarsus, and phalange bones if you want to get really technical. But I'm going to keep referring to these parts with more human terms to make your transition from the bipeds we've been working with to these quadrupeds a bit easier. So again, these are our toes here on the ground, and this is our heel with the ankle up here. All quadrupeds essentially are operating on their toes, as if their heels were lifted up, as if you had a heel roll and you were lifting that heel up off the ground. So that's what's happening here, so toe and heel. And so this joint here is the ankle, also called the hock on quadrupeds. And then we have another joint here, that's the knee. So there's actually a joint here. The knee and the lower and upper leg are all in here. Now again, in order to simplify, we're not even going to utilize the knee joint at all. We're just going to use the whole upper leg as one unit here. And we're going to be jointing at the ankle or heel here. So because we are skipping that joint, we can once again just set up a simple two-layer IK with goal in order to rig up this back foot here. And it's not completely realistic, but it works, And none of this requires anything other than what you've already learned about creating IK rigs on arms and legs. Now we'll look in a minute at how we can actually create a more realistic rig that actually takes into account the real anatomy of a quadruped. But you can see that the simple rigging on the legs works just fine and would certainly work for a more simple character or a quick turnaround situation. Now you also already know how to deal with the torso rigging, because this is just a Bezier IK torso rig just like the ones we created for the bipeds. Now you want to do the Bezier IK rig for this and not an FK rig, because you really need to have independent control over the chest and pelvis, since both the front and back legs are on the ground. This is a little less important with a biped, where you don't have both sets of limbs making contact with the ground most of the time. But it works great for quadrupeds, and this way we can grab the bottom end, and don't worry about the tail, we're going to rig that up in a minute, and we can move the front of the character, and we can get nice independent control with a little bit of shaping in the middle here just to smooth things out when necessary and just give nice arcs to the body when we need them. Just like always, we have a center of gravity that controls the entire figure, and we have a head controller that allows us to control and rotate the head. And we just added some really simple rotation controls for the ears, so you can move the ears around and do some fun expressive things with the ears. There's also an eye control. And again, none of this is any different than anything that we've looked at in any of the other rigs. And a blink controller just like we've looked at before too. So it's really just a biped on all fours. Is really as simple as it is. Now again, it can get more complicated if we want to create a more realistic representation of quadruped anatomy. And we also have the issue of a tail, which does complicate things a little. Thankfully, the Bezier IK rigging can really help us to create effective and really flexible tail rigs. So let's take a look at tail rigging being one of the things that does make a quadruped rig a little bit different. Now this can also be used for other purposes here, so keep your mind open to the possibilities, but this is an excellent means to get a nice flexible tail. So let's unshy our layers here and kind of take a look at what we have. We've already added puppet pins and bone nulls to the tail, and I actually measured these out pretty carefully so that they are dividing the tail up into thirds. Note that the tail is illustrated straight with no curvature. You'll get the widest range of motion on a tail if you rig it straight. The puppet tool does a poor job of unbending bent things, but it does a decent job of bending straight things. Now we also have our controllers created. We have a root controller here at the base of the tail, and that's going to remain hidden after we complete our rigging. But remember, we need an end and a root controller for a Bezier IK. And then we have the end controller, which right now is called tail 3, and you'll see why in a minute, but this will be one of the visible controllers to manipulate the tail. So the way we're going to rig this up, we're going to take the tail bone nulls and parent those down the line from the end to the root. And we're going to leave that bone at the root unparented. Then we're going to select from the second to last bone null down to the root, and then select the controller at the end and the controller at the root. And then we'll hit Bezier IK, and this time, instead of choosing the simple, we're going to choose the cubic, because we want to be able to create S-curves, more complicated curvature to those tails. So now we'll hit create, and you'll see that we've added 2 additional nulls, and note that they're falling pretty darn close to where those pins are, those bone nulls are, because I was pretty careful to measure those out. Now again, remember, they don't go where the pins are, they go equidistant in between the two controllers, but because I measured it out, they're falling there pretty close. And that's a good thing to do because it makes the distortion a little more accurate to what you would expect when you're clicking and dragging on those controllers, if they're really actually pulling from a pin that's exactly in that spot. Okay, so let's just recolor and rename those two tail controllers. And then we want to parent the root controller to the pelvis end. It's a pin we've placed at the very tip of the butt here to make sure that when we rotate the pelvis, we move that end of that butt and wiggle that around. And we're going to take a look at how all these pins are set up on the torso in a minute. Now note that the pelvis end is parented to the pelvis controller. So that means wherever that goes, the root of our tail will go with it. And we also want the other tail controllers also to go with that. Let's turn off this pelvis end here. So let's parent all three of these controllers once again to that pelvis end null. And then we'll zero these out. Now we have a really nice control over this tail where we can get just regular soft U-shaped bends, but we can also get S-shaped bends by manipulating these other two controllers, which gives us a lot of flexibility. Now before we move on to a little more of a complex quadruped rig, let's kind of note some of the subtle differences, particularly in the torso rigging here, between a biped and a quadruped. So if we look at how our pins are structured here, they pretty much follow the same pattern that you would expect with a biped. So there's a pelvis pin, a belly, a chest, a neck, and we forgot to note this, but if you click on the chest controller here, you do have a neck rotation there that allows you to rotate the neck. Just forgot to mention that one in our quick overview. And then of course we have a head pin for where the head attaches. And then just like we want to do pretty much any time we need a fairly close relationship between a limb on another layer and a point on the torso, we have pins right where the arms connect at those 2 points. And we have one pin where this left leg attaches, but it didn't make sense to add a pin for where the right leg attaches because it would place it so close to the belly pin that they would fight with one another, and we wouldn't get nice deformation here in the belly if we had two pins trying to do two different things here. So we just left that out, and because it's hidden behind the torso, this is very forgiving, and it doesn't require the kind of precise placement and circular overlaps that we have on these limbs that are showing. And then, as we've already noted, we have this pin right at the end of the pelvis to once again create a precise attachment point that lines up with where the tail attaches, and to make sure that when we're rotating the pelvis and moving this pin to move the area where this leg attaches, we're also moving this pin and making sure to get that butt to wiggle and to move the tail along with it. So really some very minor differences there. Now the starching, just to note, the starching is minimal, partly because an L-shaped figure as opposed to a straight figure in a biped, an L shape is much more tricky for the puppet tool to deform. So really all I did was add some starch so that the connection point, the circular overlap where the head attaches, would stay solid. But it worked best to leave starch off of the rest of the body because any starch I added created weird distortions. Anytime you tried to move the chest independently of the pelvis and vice versa, it got very messy very quickly. And the thing that looked the best time and time again was no starch at all, and it gave us the most flexibility. So the great thing about this is, aside from the tail that I just showed you how to do, you already know how to do everything that went into this rig. Just think of it, as we said, as a biped on all fours, stick a tail on there, little bit of control for the ears, and you're good to go. Now let's take a look at a more complex rig for a quadruped that tries to deal a little more realistically with the true anatomy of a quadruped. So we've got this cool skeleton cat here, and I thought it would be fun to rig the skeleton because you can really see what's happening, because a lot of the subtleties in quadruped rigging are covered up by a lot of flesh and fur a lot of the time, and you can't always see all that clearly what's happening. So this will give us a chance to really understand how this works. So first off, just note that our torso and tail rigging is exactly the same as what we looked at in the previous rig. We're going to do something a little different with the neck and the head on this rig, however, so we'll take a look at that a little bit later. But let's focus for a second on the front and back legs, and we're just going to kind of look at the left ones here that are facing towards us. Remember, we talked about the scapula, and we also talked about the front and rear pasterns, which are like the palm and the heel on a human. And with this rig, we're going to include all of that into our rigging. So let's take a look at what we have here. So we have a separate toe piece here, and we have a separate pastern piece, but we're just going to call it a heel, so you can note the similarities between this rig and the biped rigs we've been working on. But on a quadruped, it's really called a pastern, and the heel on the back leg is the rear pastern. And then we have two null objects that we're going to be using for our rigging right there at what we can think of as the ankle, if we're thinking about this as a classic heel and toe roll. And we have a null for our IK controller in order to set up that heel and toe roll. That'll all be just the same as what we've done before with legs. And then we have the lower part of the leg, we have the upper part of the leg, and then we have the scapula bone up at the top here. Let me turn this off so you can see that. So there's that scapula bone there. And again, it's like a shoulder blade. It's the same basic thing as a shoulder blade. It's just on a quadruped, it sits in the same plane as the front leg and rotates up there off of the top of the rib cage. And again, if we really want realistic movement, we want that to be able to flex and rotate like it would on a real animal. Although again, usually hidden by muscle and fur, but you do see that deformation in the real movements of animals. So let's start by parenting this all up, and then we'll go ahead and create our two IK chains that we're going to use to make this arm work. And our goal here is to get a Z-shaped IK, so that it's not just two limbs bending, it's three limbs bending in a Z shape. Now this will not work if you just try to select all four layers and just try to run the standard IK script. It won't work. The best that can do is a U shape. In order to get the Z shape, we're going to combine two chains together. So let's start with the parenting. Remember that the heel and the toe both need to be parented to the controller. And they're both rotating off of that same anchor point to create the heel and toe roll. Then we'll parent the ankle null, the stand-in null for the ankle, to the lower leg to the upper leg, and the upper leg to the scapula. Then we're going to go ahead and create our regular two-layer IK with goal. So again, we're going to start from the end of the chain to the top, so ankle, lower, upper, and then select the hidden controller we're going to use there, and we'll add our two-layer IK with goal. Then, just like we would ordinarily, we're going to take that controller and we're going to parent that to the heel. So when that heel rotates, it will operate the end of that IK chain. So now, if we were to click and drag on this controller, you can see we have our regular IK chain working, and it's flexing that arm just like we would think it would. And we've actually already rigged in the heel and toe roll that give us that additional control over that heel, aka pastern. And then of course we have the toe roll as well. But when we rotate the foot controller, we actually move that whole piece. And again, this is much more realistic to the way a real quadruped would work. Now we need to include the scapula in our chain. So in order to do that, we simply need to add a single layer IK, or a look at, to the scapula, and we'll make the left front paw controller the controller for that look at. And then that way the whole system will work together. So let's select the scapula, hold down the command key and select that controller. Then we hit IK and we choose a one-layer IK look at as our only choice. And you'll notice that adds an additional controller to our front paw controller here. I'm actually going to click and drag that to the top. And then now when I pick up and grab this controller and I rotate it, now you can see that the scapula now rotates and moves with that whole IK system in a very natural way. And the good news is I still have manual control over the scapula with the weight controller that's been added here. And as I dial this back and forth, you can see I can manually control the scapula even though it'll work with my IK chain. So now we have a really anatomically correct front leg for this quadruped. So let's zero out this controller and clean up a little before we move on to the back leg. Now with the back leg, there is no scapula. The upper leg just merely attaches to the pelvis at the hip just like you think it would. But because, as we talked about, the heel, quote unquote, is up in the air and then the toes are on the ground, so we still have this Z-shaped bend. So we're going to do this exactly the same way. The thing here is we don't have to have the heel and toe roll because our heel and toe will be part of the entire structure. So let's start by parenting these together. So in this case, we're going to do this just right up the chain from the toe to the heel, heel to the lower leg to the upper leg. And note that this time the heel and toe do not have the same anchor point. They have the anchor points just as you'd expect in a standard FK chain. And then we're going to grab the toe, heel, and lower leg, and then the controller, and we're going to add our two-layer IK with goal. And then we're going to select our upper leg and our controller again, and we're going to add our one-layer look at. Now once again, when we pick up our controller, now all three parts all move naturally together and create this kind of cool spring system. And just like with the other rig, we can adjust the weight here in order to get manual control over that upper leg. When we rotate the controller, of course, that controls the little toes there in the end. And we get a very, very intuitive and anatomically correct back leg. Let's look at a slightly different way to rig up the neck and the head. Remember that on our Fox rig here, we just set up a simple neck rotation control just like we did for our biped rigs. And we could certainly do that here with our skeleton cat. But since many quadrupeds have longer necks, depending on the art style and the type of animal it is, we can instead use a Bezier IK rig for the neck, which will give us just a little more of an intuitive control when we're dealing with longer necked animals. So let's take a look at how this works with our skeleton cat here. You'll notice that we already have bone nulls in place here on the neck. We have the usual pin at the tip of the neck where the head will attach. And then we have a pin at the base of the neck, just like we would in an ordinary biped rig. But we've included an additional pin and a bone null right in the middle that we're going to call the neck mid, and I'm going to unlock these guys here. So we're going to use the head controller, the head null controller, to control the end of the Bezier IK chain. And then we just need to create an additional null controller here at the base of the neck that we can use as a hidden controller for the root of our Bezier IK chain. And now we just need to parent these up. So we'll parent the neck tip to the neck mid. Notice we're not parenting that up to the head and back down again like we do on an ordinary biped rig, but we're just going to parent the neck tip to the neck mid to the base of the neck there, the root of the chain, and then we'll leave that root unparented. Now we just need to select from the null that is one step down from the end of our chain, which is the neck mid, and then the neck root. And then we want to choose the end controller, which is the head, and then the root controller, which is that new null that we just created. And we'll add a Bezier IK simple. And that adds our additional controller there for the neck mid. And let's go ahead and rename, recolor, and position that just a little bit with its anchor point so it sits a little better there. And then let's finish parenting this up. So we want the root controller of the neck. We want that parented to the chest controller. And we also want that new neck controller also to the chest control. And then we should go ahead and zero these out. And we also almost forgot to zero out our back paw controller. Let's zero that guy out too. Now you can see that if we click and drag on the head controller, we get this really nice natural bend to that neck. So this is a great way to set up for characters that have longer necks that you want a nice graceful curve. Alright, let's turn off some of these nulls now that we don't need to have visible anymore and lock those up. And to finish up the body rigging here, we just need to tie in our two left legs. So let's go ahead and do that. Now the front leg scapula here, we want that to be controlled when we move the chest around, but because this is sharing an anchor point with the base of the neck, it's going to make the most sense to parent that right to that neck base. So let's start by doing that. So we'll parent that right to that neck root controller that's controlling that IK chain. And then we'll take the upper back leg here, and that we want to parent to the left hip. Now when we pick up and move that chest controller, it moves the whole chest and brings those legs along with it, and when we grab the pelvis and move that, we get separate control over the pelvis. We can shape the curvature of the spine with the mid-section controller there. And we have this nice Bezier IK on the neck, which works really well. Now we've also added a slightly fancier rigging to the ears here. Rather than just having simple rotation, we've created a two-layer IK without goal for these ears. Remember how we did that for the fingers in our hand lesson, and this is exactly the same as one of those simple fingers. So when I click and drag on the controllers here, it automatically bends and rotates the ears, which works really nice. And if you want the ears to bend back the other way, you can reverse the IK orientation to do that. And we have a kind of normal eye aim control here and a blink controller, which will allow us to blink our skeleton cat's eyes. And so we have a really nice, robust, and quite anatomically correct quadruped rig here. Now that we kind of understand how this more complex anatomy works, let's take a look at another version of the fox rig where we utilize some of this additional rigging, in particular the Z-shaped IK chains that we did for the legs and arms on the skeleton cat. So the torso and the tail and the head, those are all exactly the same, but we have added the additional functionality of the scapula and that Z-shaped rigging for the front legs here. And remember again that this isn't entirely accurate. Usually the scapula would attach somewhere more up here, and more of this flexibility would be happening up in front of the rib cage. But this works fine, and you can see it does still have a really nice natural feeling to it. And then we have done the same thing with the back leg here. We've actually added that jointing for the upper, lower leg and the knee, and we've done that with a puppet tool up in this shape, and then the bottom part is set up just like a standard IK there. So now we're getting that nice additional flexibility of the upper and lower leg and the knee with that back leg there. Now this can get a little bit confusing when we're again mixing jointed parts with puppet tooled parts. So let's just really quick walk through rigging this back leg here so you can see how this works. So let's just solo these layers for now so we can focus in. And we've labeled these very much like we've been doing for our human rigs, just to help kind of understand what's happening here. So we have our separate toe piece, our heel, which is this piece here up in the air. Then we have an ankle null at the place of the ankle there, a knee null for that pin, and then a hip null for the pin up there. And of course we have our controller. Let's make sure we get that on as well. Now because we're mixing jointed parts with the puppet tool, we have to be a little careful about the parenting here. So we're going to go toe to ankle. We're going to jump right to that ankle null. And then we're going to parent the heel also to that ankle. So our initial IK chain will be toe, ankle to knee. So then we'll parent the ankle to the knee and the knee to the hip. And then we'll do our one layer IK with the hip. We want the artwork for that back leg also parented to that hip null there. And now let's set up our initial IK chain. So toe, ankle, knee, and then our controller, two-layer IK with goal. Then we're going to grab that hip and the controller again, and we'll add our one-layer IK look at. And finally, we'll parent that right hip directly to the pelvis controller because we don't actually have a hip pin for that right leg. So now when we pick up and move our controller, we once again have our Z-shaped IK chain, and we get that very natural movement through that leg. So let's go ahead and clean up a little bit. Now if I click on the center of gravity here, you can see how all those legs are now working, and we have a much more realistic rig for our fox character here. Now as we mentioned, there really wasn't all that much wrong with our first fox rig, but we were cheating the anatomy a little bit, and here we're getting a much more naturalistic movement on those legs in particular. Now one thing that I've said again and again in this course is that no two rigs are ever going to be alike, and part of the goal of this course was to teach you the intricacies and individual techniques of rigging so that you could approach different situations and customize your rigs accordingly. And just to really knock this home, let's take a look at a very different kind of quadruped rig that we have set up for you here. And it's this very graphic kitty cat here. And there was a lot of challenges with this rig, and I'm not even sure I've 100% solved all the challenges completely, but I think it's a pretty interesting rig and worth talking about, partly just because of its uniqueness. Now there's some things here that are the same as what we've looked at before. We have a Bezier IK rig for the torso. We also have a Bezier IK rig for this very, very long neck. So that's all pretty similar to what we've already looked at. But notice that the legs and feet are a little bit different. Part of the design style here is that they just come to these little tapered points, and there isn't actually the phalanges or toes off the bottom of these. So from a basic rigging standpoint, these were all pretty easy. They're all just two-layer IKs with goal, as you can see here. And there's no starching on here, so we just let them be soft and deform, and we get these lovely kind of smoothed curves. Now you can of course rotate the feet by rotating the foot controllers, but we also needed to still add heel roll to these because you need to be able to keep the feet on the ground and still be able to rock those heels back and forth. So notice on that front heel we have a heel roll. Now there's no reason for a toe roll because there are no toes. But the heel roll is very, very important to get the complete posing that we would need for this character. So if the character is crouching down and ready to pounce, we can use that heel roll to bend those feet back without the tips of the toes leaving the ground. So we've got the same exact setup on the back and the front feet with a 2-layer IK with goal and a heel roll in order to fine-tune the posing of those feet. We've also done a sort of third kind of rigging to the ears. So we showed you just a plain rotation on the first fox rig. We looked at doing a 2-layer IK without goal on the Skelecat. And here we've added 2 rotations to each ear. So we have a main ear rotation that just rotates the whole ear. And then we have ear bends on each ear. So these are just simply puppet tooled with 3 pins at the tip, middle, and the base. And then we can rotate and bend each ear to get some really nice expressive movement on the ear. So this is yet another way to rig ears. Depends again on the style of your character and how much control you need and how expressive those ears need to be. The advantage of this kind of a system over the 2-layer IK without a goal is that you don't need to flip the IK orientation to bend the ears back and forth. You can just kind of freely bend those ears all you want because it's just a simple rotation with the puppet pins. The disadvantage is you have a lot more attributes to fuss with, but you've also gotten rid of some controllers on the screen. So as always, there's a lot of give and take, pros and cons to all of the different rig setups here. We've also added some other fun rigging to the face here. We can actually move the whiskers, so the whiskers have some simple rotation controls. And the little mouth on the cat can quote-unquote smile and frown. It's not really a full smile or a full frown, but allows us to position those little parts of the character's mouth to get a little more expression there. And then we have just a rotation control for those little mouthpieces as well, just to add to our ability to create some fun poses for the face. We have our usual eye aim control and eye blink control, and we've also included individual pupil controls here, so this cat can be really quite expressive. And we have a master blink control for both eyes, as well as individual blink controls for each eye. So this cat really can do quite a lot. Now, one thing I want you to notice about how the eyes work here, notice that as we bring the blink down, the pupil is visible right up until we close the eye. Now, this is a nice trick that allows us to have basically a physical or mechanical rig for this blinking, set up basically like a squash and stretch control, but we just have a little bit of code in there to turn off the pupils once the eye blink gets to a certain place. So let's just take a quick look at that so you can see how that works, because it's a nice little trick that you can actually use in a lot of different circumstances. So you can see that we've got the pupils and then the main eyeball, and we're using the eyeball as a mat so that the pupil stays inside there. But if we open up the opacity here and take a look at the expression code, you see we're using a simple if and else situation here. And this code is available on the Useful Rigging Codes PDF we've provided for you. So what this is saying is, if the X value, which is the value of the slider, okay, so if the slider value, and by the way, this includes both the main slider and the individual slider with a little plus there, just like we did earlier, so that you can blink both eyes or an individual eye and both at once, and they'll all work together by just combining those two sliders, adding those two sliders to our X value there. So again, if the value of that slider is less than value A, and in this case value A is minus 85, so if the value of the sliders, the combined sliders, is less than 85, then the opacity has a value of 0, which is the B value here. So if X is less than A, then B. So if X, the slider, is less than minus 85, then the value of the opacity will be 0. In any other case, else, in other words, it will be the value C, which is 100%. So as we bring that slider down, as soon as that slider hits minus 85, those eyeballs just pop right off. This kind of if-else setup can be really useful in rigging for a lot of different situations. This is just one way you can use that. So a really nice way to, again, have a mechanical rig for the eyes, but be able to turn those pupils on and off automatically. Now the last thing I want to show you here, I will fully admit, is kind of weird. But I wanted to show it to you just to kind of give you some idea of where you can go with your rigging once you kind of understand the basics. And I'm not even sure if this is necessarily an ideal rig for this tail, but I tried initially creating just a Bezier IK cubic rig for the tail. But what I didn't like about it is that it distorted the artwork so much that we lost the really graphic nature of this character, and this tail really should be kind of a graphic tail. And if we look at the example that was originally provided by the illustrator, that was the way the tail was designed, as a perfect kind of vector curve. Now we needed to recreate the tail straight in order to rig it, and you have to do that pretty much in any case when you're rigging tails. Even if the character designer draws the tail curved, you're going to need a straight version of the tail in order to add rigging to it. But I didn't like the idea of distorting the line, and the puppet tool, as you probably know by now, does a pretty poor job of maintaining the consistency of a line. If you try to bend it, it's going to pinch the line, and you're going to have thinner parts and thicker parts, and you'll have little buckles and pinches along the way. So I recreated the tail as a shape layer. And if you're not familiar with shape layers, I'm not going to do a full tutorial on this, but shape layers actually give you a whole variety of ways to control the shapes. There's a lot of different options here for merging paths, which is like the Pathfinder in Illustrator, to various ways to distort and repeat shapes and create a lot of different effects with your vector shapes. So I chose the twist effect, and then I added expressions to tie these twist effects to some controllers here on the tail. The main tail controller here is also set up with a look at, so just by moving that around I can angle the tail as I wish. That's just a one-layer IK look at. Whoops, we got one little null still visible there. Oops, I didn't see that. Let me turn that off. But on that main tail controller up at the top, you can see I've added these additional controls for the twist effect. And what this will allow us to do is dial up or down this angle control here to create soft curves. And then I can grab this controller and I can kind of affect how those curls distribute along that line. One of the problems with this twist effect is that as you push it, it actually makes the tail longer and longer and longer. So I've also added a trim control which allows you to shorten the tail to kind of maintain its length generally as you're working. So again, I will fully admit that this is a pretty strange rig. I haven't actually tried this in animation. It might be a little difficult and unwieldy in animation, but the thing I like about it is that it always creates perfect smooth arcs. We never distort the quality of the line of the tail. And my thought was that it would, even if you wouldn't be able to create necessarily particularly naturalistic movements with the tail, you could create some really interesting kind of graphic movements that might be really charming with such a graphic character. So until I or someone else actually tries this out in animation, I can't absolutely guarantee that this is a great rig. But I wanted to show it to you just to show you how you can kind of think outside the box sometimes with your rigging and how you want to treat each situation individually. You're never going to recreate the exact same rig twice, or at least probably not. There's almost always going to be something that's a little different, that you set up a little differently to deal with either a different character design or a specific type of movement you need to create. And now that we've added a couple just little specialized rigging setups that are useful for quadrupeds, That plus everything you've learned about how to rig bipeds should make you able to approach just about any animal with confidence.